The town of Haller Creek, Montana, was the kind of place that remembered everything and forgave nothing. It was a small town in the way that all frontier towns were small, not just in population or geography, but in imagination. The same families had occupied the same houses for 2 generations. The same men sat on the same chairs outside the same saloon every Saturday afternoon. Gossip moved through the streets like weather, unavoidable, impersonal, and occasionally destructive. People in Haller Creek knew each other's business the way they knew the shape of the mountains, without thinking about it, without choosing to, simply because it was always there. And the business they knew best, the story they had told and retold so many times it had become something close to local legend, was the story of Harold Whitmore's daughter. Clara had been born in the middle of a November blizzard, in the back room of her father's general store, with her mother screaming and the midwife cursing the wind and Harold Whitmore standing outside in the cold because he couldn't stand the sound. Her mother, a quiet woman named Ruth, who had come from Ohio with nothing but a small trunk and a talent for mending, had survived the birth but never fully recovered from it. She spent the next 4 years growing thinner and more translucent, like paper held up to light, until one spring morning she simply didn't wake up. Clara was 4 years old. She didn't remember much about her mother. She remembered the smell of lavender and the particular softness of a hand against her cheek. She remembered the sound of humming, low and tuneless, the kind of sound a person makes when they're thinking about something else entirely. And she remembered a small wooden sparrow, carved from pale birchwood, which her mother had kept on the windowsill of the bedroom and which had disappeared sometime in the chaos following her death. After Ruth died, Harold Whitmore became a man with a grievance. He had married expecting a partner and received instead a woman who got sick and left him with a child he didn't know what to do with. That was how he framed it in his mind, Clara came to understand. Not as a loss, not as a tragedy, but as a personal inconvenience visited upon him by forces he had not consented to. He wasn't a violent man exactly. He never raised his hand to Clara. But there were so many ways to diminish a person that didn't require physical force, and Harold Whitmore had mastered most of them. He corrected her constantly, not in the gentle, instructive way of a parent teaching a child, but in the cold, contemptuous way of a man cataloging failures. Her stitching was uneven. Her arithmetic was slow. She spoke too softly in company and too loudly at home. She ate too much and worked too little. She had her mother's weak constitution and would probably end up the same way, a burden to whoever was unfortunate enough to take her on. That last part he said often enough that Clara had long since stopped hearing it as cruelty and had begun accepting it as fact. She was 23 years old, and she had spent those years working in her father's store, stocking shelves, keeping ledgers, serving customers who sometimes thanked her and more often didn't, and living in the 2 small rooms behind the storeroom where the walls were thin and the light was poor. She had no close friends. The girls she'd grown up with had married young and moved into their own lives, and Clara had watched from a comfortable distance, telling herself she didn't mind, telling herself she preferred the quiet. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore, but she had told herself the story so many times that she had forgotten where the lie began. The autumn she turned 23, Harold Whitmore received a letter. She didn't find out about the letter until 3 days after it arrived. Her father had a habit of reading his correspondence at the back desk in the storeroom, away from the main floor, and since Clara spent most of her day behind the counter or sweeping or reorganizing the dry goods display that always seemed to disorder itself, she rarely intruded on those private moments. She had learned early that intruding on Harold Whitmore's privacy, even accidentally, produced consequences not worth the information gained. So she didn't know about the letter until a Tuesday morning when her father called her into the storeroom with a tone she hadn't heard before. Not irritated or contemptuous, but something stranger, almost businesslike, and told her to sit down. The storeroom smelled of sawdust and dried beans and the particular musty warmth of a space that held too many things in too little air. Clara sat on the upturned crate her father indicated and waited. Harold Whitmore was 51 years old and looked older. Years of long winters and hard work and persistent dissatisfaction had carved his face into something angular and unforgiving. He stood at the desk with his hands folded behind his back and looked at her for a moment without speaking, which was unusual enough that Clara felt a small cold unease settle into her stomach. "I've had a business proposition," he said finally. She waited. "Man named Mercer," Caleb Mercer. He runs a cattle operation up near Blackstone Ridge. That's about 2 days north of here, up in the higher country. He paused. He's looking for a wife. Clara looked at him. He wrote to me directly, her father continued, as though this were a point of some significance. Came to me specifically, asked about you specifically. Don't ask me how he knew about you. Says he passed through here some years back and remembered you. I don't recall him. He unfolded a piece of paper from the desk and looked at it briefly, then set it back down. He's offering a fair arrangement, legitimate church marriage, his word on your care, and a financial settlement that would put this store in a considerably more comfortable position for the next few years. The cold thing in Clara's stomach spread outward. You're selling me, she said. Her father's jaw tightened. I'm arranging a marriage. There's nothing unusual about... You're selling me, she said again, not with heat, not with accusation, just with the flat, clear recognition of someone identifying a thing they have suspected for a long time. That's what this is. He's paying you and you're sending me. Harold Whitmore had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable, which was more than Clara had expected. The arrangement is mutually beneficial, he said. You're not getting any younger and your prospects here are... Clara, you know what your prospects are here. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. This man is offering you a legitimate life, a home, more security than you'd find anywhere in this town. You haven't asked me. I'm telling you. They looked at each other across the dusty space of the storeroom. Outside, through the thin wall, she could hear the street, a wagon passing, someone calling to someone else, the ordinary sounds of a day that didn't know or care what was happening inside this room. What if I refuse? Clara asked. Harold Whitmore looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. Then you stay here, he said. You keep working the store. You keep living in those back rooms. And in 10 years, you'll be doing exactly the same thing, except older. I won't pretend that benefits either of us. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in years. Clara looked down at her hands. They were rough from work, the knuckles slightly red from the cold water she used to wash the floors every morning. She thought about 10 years. She thought about the back rooms and the thin walls and the customers who looked through her. She thought about her mother, growing translucent. When does he come? She asked. Caleb Mercer arrived on a Thursday. Clara had spent the 2 intervening days constructing a careful, internal architecture of expectations. She had decided that she would not hope for anything. She had decided that the man would be either cruel or indifferent, and that she would prepare herself accordingly. She had decided that whatever came next would simply be a different kind of endurance than the one she had already mastered, and that endurance was something she knew how to do. What she had not prepared for was the particular quality of the silence that fell over Howler Creek's main street when his wagon rolled in. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of attention, the kind that happens when a space receives something that it wasn't quite expecting. She watched from behind the store window, half hidden by the edge of the curtain, and saw what the town was absorbing. Caleb Mercer was tall enough that the wagon seat seemed slightly small for him. He had the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than vanity. Broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that even at this distance looked capable and large. He was perhaps 35, maybe a year or 2 on either side. His face was weathered, but not unkind. Strong jaw, dark eyes, set under a straight brow, the particular combination of tiredness and alertness that belonged to men who worked outdoors in difficult country. He wore plain clothes, well kept. His horse was well kept too, which Clara had learned from years of observing customers told you more about a man than his clothes did. He tied off the horse, looked briefly around the street with an expression that was more observant than curious, and walked toward the store. Clara stepped back from the window. She heard him introduce himself to her father, a low, even voice, not loud, not performing, and heard her father's response, which was warmer and more eager than she had heard it in years, which told her exactly how significant the financial arrangement was. She smoothed her skirt once, unnecessarily, and walked through from the back. The man standing at the counter looked at her when she appeared, and something in his expression shifted. Something small, and not what she expected. It wasn't the appraising look she had braced for, the evaluating scan that said, "Is this worth what I'm paying?" It was something else, something harder to name. It looked almost like relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said, He didn't extend his hand, which she appreciated. She would have found that performative under the circumstances. I'm Caleb Mercer. I know, she said. My father told me. I expect he did. He held her gaze steadily. His eyes were dark brown, and there was something in them, something careful and watchful, and she thought a little guarded, like a man who had learned the cost of showing too much. I want you to know that I understand this is not an ordinary situation. It isn't, she agreed. Her father made a small sound from behind the counter, the kind designed to move a conversation forward, and Clara deliberately did not look at him. I'm not going to pretend it is, Caleb continued. I wrote to your father because I have a legitimate homestead and I'm looking for a wife, and I understand that you might have questions about what your life would look like. I'm happy to answer any of them, or if you'd rather not talk here. A slight shift of his eyes toward Harold Whitmore, brief and pointed. We could walk. It was the most consideration anyone had offered her in recent memory. Yes, Clara said. I'd rather walk. Yes. They walked the length of the main street and back, which in Haller Creek took about 12 minutes and accomplished the additional function of providing the town's residents with a sustained opportunity to observe them. Clara noticed the watchers, Mrs. Dunbar in the window of the millinery, old Pete Halverson pausing his sweeping outside the feed store, two women she'd gone to school with standing near the dry goods merchant's door and not bothering to pretend they weren't staring, and she noted them and set them aside. Caleb walked alongside her at a comfortable distance, not too close, which would have felt presumptuous, and not too far, which would have felt performative. He kept his hands in his coat pockets and looked forward rather than at her, which she appreciated. It made the conversation feel less like an audition. The ranch is about 40 miles north, he said, up near Blackstone Ridge. We'd be a full day's ride from town, maybe a little more in bad weather. There's no close neighbors. Nearest one is the Halverson family, about 8 miles south of me, and they're good people, but we're not often in each other's business. I don't mind isolation, Clara said. It was true. She had been isolated in the middle of a town for 23 years. Actual distance felt like a more honest version of the same thing. I thought you might not, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not presumptuous, just knowing, that she couldn't quite place. What kind of operation? She asked. Cattle, mostly. I run about 200 head. Managing that alone is more than one person should try. I hire 2 hands seasonal and 1 year-round. Man named Thomas, been with me about 4 years. The pasture land is decent if you manage it. The house is solid. I built it myself. He paused. It's not fancy. It's well built, and it's functional, and it's clean. I want you to know that before you agree to anything. Clara glanced at him sideways. You're not selling me on anything. No, he agreed. I'm not. Why? She asked. You could make it sound better than it is. I wouldn't know until I got there. He was quiet for a moment. Because that seems like a poor way to start something, he said finally. She didn't have an answer for that. They walked in silence for a moment. A gust of wind came down the street, carrying the smell of coming snow, and Clara pulled her coat tighter. Why me? She asked. She had decided to ask this. She had decided she would rather know and be humiliated by the answer than spend years not knowing. You must have had other options. You could have advertised. There are women who come west specifically to marry. I've seen the notices. I've heard about it. Why would you write to my father about a woman you apparently saw once, years ago, in a town you were just passing through? Caleb Mercer looked at the street ahead of them for a long moment. I had my reasons, he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. But it's the honest answer for right now, and I'd rather give you an honest, incomplete answer than a comfortable, complete one. Clara looked at him directly for the first time. That's a very particular kind of honesty. It's the only kind I know how to do, he said. He met her eyes. I'll tell you more when there's more to tell. I promise you that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked forward again. All right, she said. All right, what? All right, I'll go. I'll marry you. She kept her voice level. I want to be clear that I'm not going because I think this is romantic or because I have any particular faith that it will be good. I'm going because staying here is its own kind of slow end, and whatever you are, you're at least something different. Caleb Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's a fair position. I'm not interested in your approval, she said. I know, he said, and he almost smiled. Not quite, but the shadow of it. I wasn't offering it. They were married 2 days later in the small office of the Justice of the Peace, with her father and Thomas Greer, Caleb's year-round hand who had come down with the wagon, as witnesses. The justice, a man named Cooper, who smelled of pipe tobacco and processed the paperwork with the enthusiastic efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found it neither wonderful nor terrible, read the required words. Clara wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and had a small tear at the left cuff that she had mended twice. She had considered asking to borrow something from one of the town women and had decided she would rather get married in a mended dress than owe anyone a favor on this particular day. Caleb wore a clean white shirt and his hat in his hand. He said the required words in his low, even voice. When Cooper indicated the moment for the ring, Caleb produced from his coat pocket a thin gold band, plain and without ornamentation, and placed it on Clara's finger with a care that was almost excessive, as though he was afraid of breaking something. She looked at the ring on her hand. Then she looked up at him. His expression was difficult to read. There was something in it, that same quality she had seen when she first walked into the store, that thing that looked like relief, or something adjacent to it. A tension going out of a muscle that had been braced for a long time. She didn't understand it. She filed it away. They left Haller Creek at first light the following morning. Harold Whitmore came to see them off, which Clara had not expected. He stood at the edge of the street in his coat and watched them load the wagon. Thomas tying off the ropes over the boxes that contained Clara's few belongings, Caleb checking the horse's harness with methodical attention. And when it was time to go, he came to the wagon and looked up at Clara, who was already seated. She waited. Right when you get there, he said. It was not an apology. It was not a reckoning. It was simply the closest he knew how to come to either, and she understood that, and she nodded once. If I have the inclination, she said. She turned forward. Thomas clucked at the horse, and the wagon rolled, and Clara did not look back. She had expected to feel something, grief, or anger, or relief, or some cocktail of all three. Instead, she felt the wind against her face and the solid rattle of the wagon beneath her. And she watched the edge of Haller Creek give way to open country, and she thought, whatever comes next, I am not pretending it is the same. The road north took them through country that Clara had never seen, though she had lived her whole life with the mountains visible from every window in town. Seeing mountains in the distance and traveling toward them were entirely different experiences. The landscape transformed gradually. First the flat, wind-scoured basinland of the valley, then the long slope upward into foothills where the grass grew rougher and the trees started to appear, ponderosa and lodgepole pine in increasing density, and then real elevation, real country, where the road narrowed and the switchbacks began, and the air changed character and became something you were more conscious of breathing. Thomas Greer rode ahead on horseback, partly to scout the road and partly, Claire suspected, because he was a man who preferred his own company and found the wagon's pace frustrating. He was perhaps 50, lean and weathered past lean into something that was mostly sinew and habit, with a way of sitting a horse that looked like he'd been born doing it. He had acknowledged Clara's existence with a nod at their introduction, and had not, in the 2 days since, offered much more than that, which she found she didn't mind. She sat beside Caleb on the wagon bench. They did not talk constantly. There were stretches of an hour or more where neither of them spoke, and Clara waited for this to feel awkward and found that it didn't, which surprised her. She was accustomed to silence being loaded. Her father's silences were always charged with something, judgment or disappointment, or simply the accumulated weight of his presence. But Caleb Mercer's silence felt different. It felt like a person thinking rather than a person withholding. On the first afternoon, he asked her, "Do you like to read?" "Yes," she said, "though I haven't had much access to." "I have about 60 books," he said, "at the ranch, various. Some of them I've read twice and wouldn't mind discussing." She looked at him. "You read?" Something shifted in his expression. It might have been amusement or the suppression of it. "You sound surprised." "Most men I know regard reading as a weakness," she said. "Most men you know are fools," he said simply, without heat. She turned back to the road. "Yes," she agreed. "They are." They made camp that first night at the edge of a creek, under a stand of cottonwoods that were down to their last few gold leaves. Thomas built the fire with the competence of long practice and produced from the wagon's supply box a quantity of beans and salt pork that became, with some effort, a reasonable meal. Clara helped without being asked, which earned her a single glance from Thomas that might have been approval or might have been assessment. She ate from a tin plate and listened to the creak and the fire and the distant sound of the horses shifting in their tethers, and she thought, "This is nothing like what I expected." She was not sure yet whether that was good or bad. That night she slept in the wagon bed, wrapped in the blankets Caleb had provided without comment, while the men slept by the fire. The sky above was enormous, clearer than anything she had ever seen in town, where buildings and chimney smoke always cut the view, and she lay on her back and looked at it for a long time before she could sleep. She was thinking about the wooden sparrow her mother had kept on the windowsill. She had been thinking about it, off and on, for years. The small carved thing, pale and smooth, the way the light had caught it in the mornings. She didn't know why it came to her now. Probably because she was leaving, and leaving always brought up things you were moving away from. She closed her eyes. She was moving toward something else. She didn't know what. On the second day, the road grew genuinely difficult. Steeper, rockier, demanding more from the horse and more from the people guiding it. Caleb handled the wagon with calm competence, making adjustments she wouldn't have known to make, reading the terrain in a way that spoke of long familiarity. Thomas rode ahead and came back periodically with information about the state of the path. In the afternoon, they crested a long ridge, and she saw it for the first time. Blackstone Ridge was named for a dark formation of volcanic rock that ran along the eastern edge of the valley like the spine of something ancient and enormous. The valley below it was broad and sheltered, the high country's version of sheltered, which meant less wind rather than no wind and good grass by mountain standards. A creek ran through it, fed by snowmelt, running clear and fast. And in the middle of the valley's southern end, set back from the creek but positioned to use it, was the ranch. The house was larger than she'd expected. Built from logs, 2 stories, with a porch running the full width of the front. A barn, well-maintained, with a smaller structure beside it, probably the tack room or storage. A kitchen garden, dormant for winter now, but clearly substantial. The raised beds still neatly edged. Corrals. A smokehouse. The infrastructure of a life that had been built carefully and with intention. "That's it," Caleb said. Clara looked at it for a long moment. "You built this yourself?" "Most of it. Thomas helped with the framing, hired 2 men for the barn roof." He looked at the valley with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not pride exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a thing that required doing. "It took about 3 years to get it where it is. Still things I want to do." She didn't answer. She was looking at the house, at the porch with its solid railing, at the kitchen garden with its careful rows. There was something about its tidiness, not the ornamental tidiness of a place built for display, but the functional order of a place built for use, that was doing something unexpected to the careful architecture of her expectations. It looked like someone had spent 3 years building a home. For whom, she wondered, and then set the thought aside. The inside of the house was warmer than the outside, which was the first thing she noticed. Good insulation, she would learn later, from Caleb's careful attention to the chinking between the logs. The main floor was one large open space, kitchen along the back wall, a long table, a sitting area with a stone fireplace that was already laid and ready to be lit. Shelves on the wall, and there, she stopped. Books. More than 60, she thought. He had underestimated. They covered 2 full shelves and part of a third, arranged with what appeared to be a loose organization by subject. She moved toward them without planning to, reached out and touched the spines. "You can read any of them," Caleb said from behind her. "No restrictions on that." She turned around. He was standing near the door, his hat in his hands, watching her with that expression she kept not quite being able to identify. "The bedroom upstairs," he said. "That's yours. I'll be in the room off the kitchen. It was meant as a pantry, but I moved the stores to the cellar. It's small, but it's private." She looked at him. "You're giving me the bedroom." It's the larger space. It gets the morning light. He said this simply, as though it required no explanation. She opened her mouth, then closed it. All right, she said. She took her carpet bag and went up the stairs. The bedroom was indeed larger than she'd expected. A good-sized room under the sloping ceiling of the upper floor, with a window that faced east. There was a bed, solid and well-made, with a quilt on it, a small dresser, a chair by the window. And on the windowsill, she stopped. There was a small wooden carving there. A bird, she thought at first. She moved closer. A sparrow, carved from pale birch wood, worn smooth with handling, no bigger than her palm. She stood very still. It was probably nothing. It was probably just a carving. Men made them, whittled things on long winter evenings. There was nothing unusual about a small wooden bird on a windowsill. It was probably coincidence, the resemblance to the one she remembered from her childhood, the one that had sat on her mother's windowsill and disappeared. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. The carving was simple but careful. The wing feathers suggested rather than detailed. The small head turned slightly as though the bird was listening for something. Her hands were not entirely steady. She set it back on the windowsill. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a long time. It's just a carving, she told herself. There are 1,000 wooden sparrows in the world. You don't know that it's the same one. You can't know that. She was right. She couldn't know. But something had settled in her chest that was not quite the cold nothing she had carried on the wagon seat out of Haller Creek. And she didn't know what to do with it, so she did what she always did. She set it aside and went downstairs to help with supper. In fact, the first weeks at Blackstone Ridge were, in their way, the strangest of her life. Not because anything dramatic happened. Quite the opposite. The strangeness was in the absence of what she had been expecting. The edge, the contempt, the casual diminishment that had been such a constant in her previous life that she had stopped recognizing it as unusual. There was none of it, none. Caleb treated her with a consistent, unremarkable respect that was so different from what she was accustomed to that she spent the first 2 weeks waiting for it to break, for the careful courtesy to reveal itself as performance, for the real thing underneath to show its edges. She watched him the way she had learned to watch her father, looking for the signs, the slight tightening around the eyes, the particular quality of silence that meant something was building, the small cruelties that arrived sideways and without warning. They didn't come. He taught her things she needed to know without condescending to her ignorance. The first morning, she burned the porridge, genuinely burned it, black on the bottom, the acrid smell filling the kitchen, and she braced herself for the response. He looked at the pot, looked at her, and said, "The fire's hotter than town stoves. Takes some adjusting to." Then he helped her start over without making her feel like she'd failed a test. When she asked questions about the ranch, he answered them fully and without the impatience she had expected. When she offered opinions, he listened to them, genuinely. She could tell the difference. She had extensive experience with the alternative, and sometimes he changed his approach based on what she said, which was so unexpected that the first time it happened, she stood in the kitchen for a full minute after he left, just absorbing it. He gave her autonomy over the kitchen and the garden planning and the household stores with a thoroughness that told her he had thought about it in advance, had decided, before she arrived, that these would be her domains and that he would not second-guess her in them. He was wrong about some things she knew, and he was right about others. And he accepted the corrections she offered with the same equanimity he brought to everything else. "You're not what I expected," she told him one evening. They were sitting by the fire after supper. Thomas had gone to his quarters in the barn loft, which was where he preferred to sleep, and the wind was doing something complicated around the corners of the house that made the fire throw interesting shadows. Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Someone harder. Someone with a reason." "Everyone has a reason," he said. "For treating someone poorly, I mean. A justification." She paused. "Most people, when they have power over someone, find ways to use it, even small ways, even people who don't think of themselves as cruel." He considered this. "I know what you mean," he said, "but you don't." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I try not to," he said finally. "I won't tell you I've always succeeded." It was honest in the particular way she was starting to recognize as his, not claiming more virtue than he had, not performing humility either, just the actual truth of the thing. Why? She asked. Why try? Most people don't bother. He looked at her then, and something moved in his expression. That same guarded, careful thing she kept seeing and not being able to name. Because I know what it costs, he said, being on the other side of it. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. He went back to the harness. She looked at the fire. I know what it costs. What did that mean? Who had cost him? When? And how? She filed it away with the other things she was collecting, the wooden sparrow on the windowsill, the relief on his face when she first walked into the store, the house built with such deliberate care, the books, the kitchen garden with its careful rows. There was a story here that she didn't yet have all of. She was beginning to think she needed to. November brought the first real snow. It came overnight. She woke to the particular silence of a world that had been muffled, that altered quality of morning light that meant white outside. And she stood at her east-facing window and watched the valley below the ridge emerge from it. The snow had softened everything, rounded the edges of the corrals and the barn roof, turned the dormant kitchen garden into a series of gentle mounds, made the creek into a dark line cutting through the white. It was, she realized with some surprise, very beautiful. She had grown up with Montana winters. She had spent 23 years enduring them. The cold, the dark, the confinement, the interminable sameness of a small town buried under snow. She had never, in all those years, stood at a window and thought, this is beautiful. She had thought, this will end eventually. She had thought, at least it keeps people inside. She had thought many things that were some form of endurance. She hadn't thought beautiful. She stood at the window for a while longer than was strictly efficient, watching the snow-covered valley and the dark line of the creek and the dark shapes of the Hereford cattle moving slowly through the white, and she was almost late starting breakfast, which she corrected by moving faster than usual, and which Caleb, when he came in from the morning chores, did not comment on. "Snow's early this year," he said, pouring coffee from the pot she'd made. "Is that a problem?" "Some. The south pasture fence has a section I wanted to repair before it got bad. If the ground's frozen solid, it'll have to wait until spring." He sat down at the table and wrapped his hands around the mug. "I'll check it today, see what the situation is." "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "It's cold out." "I know it's cold out," she said. "I've lived in Montana my whole life. I know what cold is." She paused. "I've been inside for 3 days. I'd like to see the pasture." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "All right, dress warm." They rode out on horseback. She had learned in the past weeks that she was not as hopeless a rider as she'd believed, simply inexperienced, and that inexperience was a correctable condition. And she saw the ranch in a way she hadn't from the windows or the yard. The scale of it, the way the land rolled and dipped, how the creek changed character as it moved through different sections, where the cattle clustered naturally and where they avoided. Caleb pointed things out as they rode, not lecturing, just noting, the way a person shows a place to someone they think deserves to understand it. At the fence line, where 3 posts had heaved from the freeze and thaw of the previous weeks, Caleb dismounted and walked the section, pressing at the posts with his boot, testing. Clara dismounted and walked with him, watching. "Can it be fixed now?" she asked. "2 of them, maybe. This one," he crouched beside the worst post, "needs to come out and go back deeper. Can't do that safely until the ground thaws." He stood. "It'll hold through the winter if I brace it. Not ideal, but it'll do." She crouched beside it herself and looked at the way it listed. "What if you added a diagonal support? From here to the corner post, it would reduce the lateral load on the—" She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that was not condescension, not surprise, something more like genuine attention. "Where'd you learn fence mechanics?" he asked. "My father's store sold fencing supplies," she said. "I kept the inventory and placed orders, and I read the information materials." She straightened. "Probably too much reading." "There's no such thing," he said. He looked back at the post. "You're right about the diagonal. It's a better solution than bracing." A pause. "I wouldn't have thought of it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that should have been unremarkable. Someone offering a practical suggestion, someone else acknowledging it was a good one. Ordinary." And yet, standing at a frostbitten fence post on a snow-covered ridge in November, Clara felt something move in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. "You're right," he had said. "I wouldn't have thought of it." Not, "What would you know about it?" Not just what the supply pamphlet said, not the 1,000 small dismissals she had collected over 23 years like stones in her pockets. Just, "You're right." She turned away and looked at the valley, at the broad white expanse of it with the mountains beyond, and she thought, this is what it feels like when someone takes you seriously. She had not known she was starving for it until she began to be fed. But the weeks continued. The snow deepened. The work of the ranch became her work too, not by assignment, but by the gradual natural process of seeing what needed doing and doing it. She patched a section of the barn wall she discovered was letting in wind, reorganized the root cellar to reduce spoilage, started a study of the previous year's stock records that Caleb kept in a ledger, and found 3 places where his practices could be adjusted to reduce loss in the spring. "You have a head for this," Caleb said one evening, looking over the notes she'd made. "I ran my father's books for 6 years," she said. "He paid me nothing, but I learned the books." Something moved across his face. "He paid you nothing." "He paid me room and board," she said, which was also his room and board. So really, he paid himself. She said it without bitterness. She had moved past bitterness a long time ago into something more neutral, more factual, and she saw him take it in. "I'll make sure you know the finances here," he said. "All of them. You should know what we have, what we're spending, where we are." She looked at him. "That's not the usual arrangement." "I know," he said. "I think it should be." "I think it should be." Not, of course, naturally, what other way would there be? He knew it was different. He had considered it and decided deliberately. She returned to the ledger and said nothing, but she was thinking, who taught you this? Who showed you that this was the better way? And then, for the first time, a different question. Was it someone I know? Christmas came and went without ceremony. They were not a ceremonious household, but Caleb had ordered, through Thomas's last trip to town for supplies, a length of emerald green wool fabric that he set on the kitchen table without explanation or flourish. And when she asked what it was for, he said, "I thought you might want something that wasn't dark blue." She held the fabric for a moment. She looked at it for a long moment, not trusting her face. "Thank you," she said. "It's practical," he said, unnecessarily. "Yes," she said. "It is." She made a dress from it over the following 2 weeks, working in the evenings by the fire, and when she wore it for the first time, she caught him looking at her across the breakfast table with an expression that he quickly rearranged into something more neutral. She decided not to remark on it. She was beginning to understand something, piece by careful piece, like a puzzle assembled from fragments you find in different rooms of a house. She was beginning to understand that the man she had married was carrying something, that beneath the quiet steadiness, beneath the practical competence and the considered kindness, there was something weighted. A history she hadn't been shown, a thing he was holding at a careful distance, even as he led her closer in every other regard. The wooden sparrow sat on the windowsill. She looked at it every morning. She was waiting for something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. Winter had more to tell her. The January cold was a different animal than November's. November. Cold had a kind of novelty to it. The first snow, the first mornings where breath came out in clouds, the first evenings where the fire wasn't optional. January cold was something you simply lived inside of, the way you lived inside a house that had no other rooms. It settled into the valley like a permanent resident, cracking the water in the barrel overnight, making the horses' coats grow thick and rough, turning the creek at its edges into layered shelves of ice that Clara found herself studying on her morning walks with a fascination she couldn't entirely explain. She had started taking morning walks. This was not something she had done in Holler Creek, where walking without purpose attracted comment, and where the streets in any season felt like a space she was occupying only temporarily by permission. Here there was no one to comment and no permission required, and the valley in early morning, before Thomas had started the barn work, before the day had acquired its particular demands, was a different place than the valley at any other hour. Quieter, more absolute, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing and your own footsteps, and the way a magpie's call carried uninterrupted across a quarter mile of frozen air. She was usually back at the house before Caleb came in from checking the cattle, which he did every morning at first light regardless of the temperature. But on a Tuesday in the second week of January, she came back later than she'd planned. She had gone farther than usual, following the creek upstream to a place where it narrowed and dropped over a small shelf of rock, frozen now into a suspended curtain of ice that caught the low morning light in a way she wanted to stand near for a while, and found him already in the kitchen with his coat still on, his hands wrapped around a mug, waiting. He looked at her when she came in. "I was about to go looking," he said. "I went farther than I meant to." She unwound her scarf and hung it on the peg. "I didn't think you'd notice." "I notice," he said. He said it simply, without elaboration, and went back to his coffee. She went to the stove to check on the porridge she'd left. It was fine. She had learned the fire by now. She was aware, in the way she was increasingly aware of things in this house, of the weight behind those two words. "I notice." Not said as accusation or surveillance, said as fact. He paid attention to where she was. He had been about to go looking. She didn't know what to do with that, so she served breakfast and they talked about the south pasture fence, which he had reinforced with the diagonal support she'd suggested, and which had held through the worst of the cold, and the day moved forward, but the phrase stayed with her. "I notice." It was a small thing to be undone by. She was aware of that. By February, she had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. She hadn't decided to stop. It was more that she realized one morning, stirring coffee and looking at the steam come off the surface, that she had gone several days without bracing herself. Without doing the internal calculation she had run so automatically for so many years that it had become invisible to her. Assess the mood, adjust the presentation, anticipate the possible points of failure, minimize exposure. The calculation her father had trained her to run without knowing he was training her. The constant low-level scan for where the next diminishment was coming from and how bad it would be. She had stopped running it. Or not stopped. More that it had quieted. Become intermittent rather than constant. On its better days it felt almost like rest. Thomas Greer, who remained a man of few words and no wasted motion, had begun to acknowledge her existence with a slightly expanded vocabulary. This was not dramatic. It meant he sometimes said 2 sentences to her instead of 1, and occasionally asked a direct question rather than simply responding to hers. But it felt, from him, like significant warmth. He had been at Blackstone Ridge for 4 years. He knew Caleb in the way long-term hands know the men they work for, not personally, not socially, but with the comprehensive functional understanding of someone who has watched another person under pressure in all seasons. She started asking him things, carefully, in the way she had learned to gather information from unwilling sources, sideways, casually, as though the question were incidental. "How long has Caleb had the herd?" she asked one afternoon, when she was bringing lunch to the barn and Thomas was repairing a bridle. "Bought the first 20 head about 6 years ago," Thomas said, not looking up from the stitching. "Built it up slow. He's careful about it. Doesn't expand faster than the pasture can support." "And the house?" "He built that himself," he said. "Most of it. Took about 3 summers." Thomas pulled the thread taut and reached for the next length. "He's particular about the house." "Particular how?" Thomas glanced up at her then, a brief, assessing look. "The details," he said. "Most men build what's functional and stop there. Caleb kept going, the porch railing. Didn't need to be as solid as he made it. The bedroom windows, he replaced them twice until the fit was right." He paused. "The kitchen shelving he built last summer." "The shelving?" She had noticed it. Deep, well-measured shelves at exactly the right height, with a small lip at the front to keep things from sliding. She had thought it was simply good craftsmanship. "Rebuilt it," Thomas said. "Original shelves were fine. He tore them out in August and started over." He bit off the thread. "Said the depth was wrong." Clara was quiet for a moment. "The depth was wrong for what?" Thomas looked at her with an expression that suggested he had said more than he'd planned to and was now performing a recalculation. "For storage, I suppose," he said, and returned to the bridle. She let the conversation end there, but she carried the piece of it home with her. Rebuilt the shelves, said the depth was wrong, and set it alongside the other pieces she had been collecting. The kitchen garden with its particular layout, the east-facing bedroom window, the books, the quilt on the bed, which she had examined one afternoon and recognized as new, the fabric barely worn, the stitching still tight, Someone had made it specifically, not Caleb's hands. The work was too fine, the pattern too deliberate, but someone he had engaged or someone he had bought it from. All of it pointed in the same direction. Someone had built this house for an arrival they were expecting. She asked him directly on a Wednesday evening in the middle of February, when the wind was doing its worst outside and the fire was doing its best inside, and they were both too confined by weather to pretend they weren't sharing a small space. She had been reading. He had been going over the spring supply list, making adjustments, crossing things off, and adding others in his unhurried way. The lamp between them gave the room a particular amber quality, the kind of light that softens the boundaries between things and makes conversation feel less formal than it might in daylight. "Who did you build this house for?" she asked, without looking up from her book. The scratching of his pencil stopped. "What makes you ask that?" His voice was level. "The shelving in the kitchen," she said. "Thomas told me you rebuilt it last August. The quilt on my bed is new, made specifically, not pulled from storage. The garden layout is designed for someone who knows what they're doing, which you didn't build it assuming would be you." She looked up. "The whole house is built for someone you imagined here. I want to know who." Caleb set down his pencil. He looked at the fire for a moment, then at her. "You," he said. The words sat in the room. Clara held her book in her lap and did not move. "We had not met," she said carefully. "You didn't know me." "I knew of you," he said. "I knew enough." "Caleb?" Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness for 23 years. "Tell me what that means." He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, she thought, more like a man choosing where to start a story that doesn't have an obvious beginning. He picked up his coffee mug and held it without drinking from it and looked at the fire. "I came through Howler Creek 15 years ago," he said. "I was 20, 21, somewhere in there. I'd left home at 16 when things got bad enough that leaving seemed like the better option." He paused. "My father was not a gentle man. I won't say more than that. I left and I went wherever work was, which meant I worked for anyone who'd have me, which meant the terms weren't always good." Another pause. "I came through Howler Creek in late October. I'd been 3 weeks without steady pay, and I was not in a good way." Clara did not speak. "I came into your father's store," Caleb said. "I was going to ask about work. I didn't have enough for the night's lodging. The man at the counter, your father, I know that now. He looked at me the way men like that look at someone who obviously has nothing, and he said there was nothing for me there." He stopped. "I was about to leave." She could feel something building in her chest. She kept her face still. "There was a girl," he said, "behind the counter, off to the side. I almost didn't notice her. 8, maybe. Small." He looked at Clara directly then, and his eyes were steady and serious. "She waited until your father was talking to someone else. She came around the counter, quick, like she was used to doing things fast and quiet. And she pressed something into my hand. Bread, wrapped in a cloth. And a few coins, which I found out later when I looked." He paused. "She didn't say anything to me. Just handed it over and went back around the counter, like it was nothing. Like it was just what you did when someone needed something." Claire's book had gone very still in her lap. "She did look back at me once," Caleb said, "when I was going out the door, and she looked sorry. Not pitying, different from pity. Like she understood something about it." He looked at the fire. "I was 20 years old, and I'd been traveling alone for 4 years, and I had not met many people who were sorry without being superior about it. That mattered more than the bread." The wind pushed against the house. The fire shifted and settled. "I looked at her as I left," he said, "and she'd gone back to her work, whatever she was doing, and she didn't look at me again." A pause. "I left town that afternoon, found work 2 towns north that lasted me the winter, saved enough to head further west the following spring, spent the next decade working my way toward having something worth stopping for." He set his mug down. "I thought about her sometimes. The girl in the store. More than made sense, probably." "You built a house based on a memory," Clara said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. "I built a house because I needed a house," he said. "But when I thought about the details, how to plan it, what would matter, I kept coming back to what I imagined she might want. What kind of woman that girl grew into, whether there was somewhere she'd want to be." He met her eyes. I didn't know your name. I didn't know if you were still there. I sent a letter to Howler Creek, general inquiry, and it found its way to your father. A pause. I want you to know that I didn't tell him why. I only said I was looking for a wife and understood he might have a daughter of marriageable age. He would have sold me to anyone, Clara said. The words were flat, factual. I know, I'm not pretending the arrangement was anything other than what it was. He looked at her steadily. But I'm telling you that it wasn't indifferent, that I wasn't buying a convenience. I came looking for you specifically. She looked at him for a long moment. You could be wrong, she said. About what I am, about what you remember. You met a girl for 30 seconds 15 years ago. You could have built a life around a story you told yourself. Yes, he said. That's possible. And? And it's been 4 months, he said simply. And I'm not wrong. It was said without arrogance, without performance. Just a man who had made a long and consequential bet and was stating clearly that the outcome so far supported the wager. Clara looked at the fire. She thought about the bread. She had given away food from the store sometimes, scraps mostly, things that were going to spoil anyway, when her father wasn't watching, to people who came through Howler Creek clearly in need. She had done it quickly and quietly because that was the only way to do it, and she had never expected anything from it, because wanting something in return felt like it changed what the act was. She had done it so many times, she didn't remember individual instances. She didn't remember him. I don't remember you, she said. It felt important to be honest about that. I know, he said. I didn't expect you to. She looked at the sparrow on the windowsill. She had brought it down from the bedroom at some point and placed it on the shelf near the fire, and now it sat there among other things, a small pale shape among the lamp oil and the spare candles. The sparrow, she said. He nodded. You handed it to me with the bread. I found it in the cloth when I stopped to eat, couple miles out of town. I thought it was an accident at first that it had just been wrapped in there, but I couldn't think of why a girl would have a wooden bird in her apron pocket unless it was on purpose. He paused. So I kept it. She stared at him. You kept it for 15 years, she said. Yes. Why? He looked at her with that expression she had been trying to name for 4 months, that careful, guarded thing. And finally she saw it clearly for what it was. It was not guardedness, exactly. It was the expression of a man who was hoping very hard for something and refusing to lean on the hoping too much. Because I didn't want to forget what it looked like, he said, when someone was decent without an audience. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind ran along the eaves with a sound like breathing. Clara looked at the sparrow, the small pale bird that her mother had kept on a windowsill, that she had pressed into the hand of a starving boy she'd never see again, that had traveled west with him for 15 years and come back to a windowsill again, in a house built on the memory of 30 seconds of ordinary decency. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago not to cry, but something shifted in her chest, something that had been positioned at an angle for so long she had forgotten it could sit straight. And she felt it move, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum briefly, as though she could hold the sensation there. I should have told you before, Caleb said. He was watching her carefully. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then decided the right moment was a fiction I was hiding behind. Yes, she said. You should have. Are you angry? She considered it honestly, the way she had learned to consider things since coming here. Not performing either anger or forgiveness, but actually checking. No, she said. Not angry. A pause. I don't know what I am. That's fair, he said. They sat in the amber light with the wind outside, and neither of them reached for their previous occupations. The book, the pencil, the supply list. And after a while, Caleb said, I know it doesn't change what the arrangement was, what your father did or what you agreed to because you didn't have better options. I'm not asking you to... He stopped, chose his words. I'm not asking you to feel a certain way about it. I just wanted you to know the truth of it. I know, she said. Another pause. The fire was lower now. What was her name? Clara asked. Your mother. You said your father wasn't a gentleman. Was your mother... She was all right, he said quietly. Better than the situation. She died when I was 14. He said it in the way of a person who has said a thing so many times that the saying no longer breaks anything, just a fact, carried. That's when I started counting the years until I could leave. I'm sorry, Clara said. I know, he said. And the way he said it, the way he received it, simply, without deflecting or minimizing, told her that he did know, and that he understood the difference between sorry and pity. She reached out and picked up the wooden sparrow, turned it in her hands. The pale wood was smooth, worn smooth by years of handling. She could feel that, the satiny quality of something touched often, kept close. She set it back down on the shelf. I'm going to bed, she said. She stood up and looked at him. Thank you for telling me. He nodded. There was something in his face that hoping thing held carefully back from leaning, and she decided not to address it directly. Not tonight, because she was still absorbing too much to know what to do with any of it. She took the lamp and went up the stairs, and she lay in the bed he had given her in the house he had built thinking about her, and she stared at the ceiling for a long time. She had been handed over like goods, and she knew that. The mechanics of what had brought her here were not pretty, and she had no interest in prettying them. But underneath the mechanics was something else, a story she had not been told, a boy starving in late October, a girl who didn't think twice, a wooden bird traveling west for 15 years. And she lay there in the dark and turned it over and could not decide if it made her feel more certain or less about the ground she was standing on. What she felt, more than anything, was something she did not entirely have a word for. Not loved. It was too early for that, or the wrong shape for that, and she was too careful a person to reach for big words before she'd earned them. But seen, maybe. Remembered. Counted as something by someone who had no reason to count her. After 23 years of being subtracted from every room she entered, the arithmetic felt extraordinary. She closed her eyes and let the darkness hold her, and she thought, whatever this is, I am not afraid of it. That was new, too. March arrived without ceremony. A slight softening of the cold, a few days where the temperature climbed above freezing, and the snow at the south-facing edges of the ranch began to show dark patches of ground beneath. The creek noise changed, less the muffled, contained sound of near-frozen water, more the beginning of something with intent. Clara noticed the change the way she had been noticing everything since coming to Blackstone Ridge. Not intellectually, from a distance, but with her actual body, her actual skin, the particular animal awareness of a person who has started to inhabit a place rather than merely occupy it. She was inhabiting this place. She noticed that too. The conversation by the fire had changed something between them. Not dramatically, not with any sudden warmth that would have felt theatrical and false, but in the incremental way that things change when a secret is no longer a secret. A wall had been replaced by something more permeable, and they moved through the house differently now. Talked more in the evenings, disagreed more freely. She found she was more willing to push back on his assumptions once she understood that the thing he was building here was real, that he wasn't going to withdraw the consideration the moment she stopped being compliant. One afternoon, she contradicted him flatly about the rotation schedule for the eastern pasture in front of Thomas, which she had not done before. Thomas kept his eyes on the fence post he was setting. Caleb looked at her for a moment, then said, "Walk me through your reasoning." She did. He listened. He said, "You're right about the timing, but the problem is the fencing on the east side won't hold another season of that herd weight." He paused. "I was going to repair it in April. If we repair it now while it's still cold enough to set properly, your rotation makes sense." "Then let's repair it now," she said. They repaired it over the following weekend, all three of them, working in the stubborn cold with Thomas driving the posts and Caleb stretching the wire, and Clara, who had come out in her heaviest coat with no announcement and the clear intention of being useful, handling the staple gun on the existing sections while the men did the heavier work. Thomas watched her drive a staple with the competence of someone who had been shown once and paid close attention, and he said, unprompted, which was unusual enough to mark the moment, "You're going to be all right here." She looked at him. "That's high praise from you." "I'm not a man who wastes praise," he said. She thought about that later. "You're going to be all right here." Not, "welcome." Not, "you've earned a place." Just a direct and unsentimental statement of likely outcome, delivered by a man who chose his words the way a careful farmer chose seeds, only what would actually grow. She decided it was the best compliment she had received in years. She wrote to her father that night, not because she'd promised to, not exactly, but because she found she had something to say that wasn't about obligation. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that the ranch was larger than she'd expected, and the work was hard, and the winter had been long. She wrote, "I don't know if you're curious, but I'm not unhappy." She sealed it and gave it to Thomas to take to town on his next supply run. And she did not wait for a reply with any particular urgency. She was learning that she could write her own story from here. That was, she was beginning to understand exactly what this place had been built for. Spring came to Blackstone Ridge the way it always came to high country, reluctantly, in stages, with frequent reversals that reminded you it wasn't done with winter yet and wouldn't be pushed. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, exposing ground that was dark and saturated and smelled of everything that had been locked underneath since November. The creek rose with the melt, running fast and loud, carrying a quantity of silt that turned it the color of weak tea for most of April. The cattle, who had spent the hard months in the lower pasture where the hay could reach them, began moving outward again with the particular purposeful drift of animals following the grass as it came back up through the mud. Clara moved outward too. She had spent the winter learning the inside of the ranch, the kitchen, the root cellar, the ledgers, the barn on the days when she had reason to be there. Spring gave her the outside in a way that winter hadn't, and she took it the way she was learning to take things here, without excessive announcement, simply by doing. She started spending her afternoons in the kitchen garden, turning the beds, working in the compost Thomas had been accumulating, planning what would go where with the same methodical attention she had once given to her father's inventory records. Caleb watched this without comment, which was itself a kind of comment. On an afternoon in the second week of April, he came to the fence of the garden and leaned against it and observed her staking out the bean rows and said, "You could expand to the south side. Another 12 feet, maybe 15. The light's good down there." She sat back on her heels and looked at the south side. "That's a lot of digging." "I'll dig it," he said. She looked at him. He said it the way he said most things, as though the offer was obvious rather than generous, as though it required no particular acknowledgement. "All right," she said, "but I want to plan what goes there first." "Of course," he said. He dug it on Saturday, working steadily through the better part of the morning with Thomas handling the rockier sections near the fence line. Clara brought them coffee at mid-morning and stood at the edge of the new plot and looked at the turned earth and felt something that she was still getting used to feeling, the particular satisfaction of a thing being built that she was part of. It was not a feeling she had words for. It sat in her chest like the smell of turned earth, specific, grounded, alive, and fun. What changed in April was not dramatic. It was not a single moment. It was more like the way a river changes course, not suddenly, not with any one event you can point to, but through the accumulated pressure of water finding the lower ground. Clara was aware, in the quiet hours of early morning before the day made its demands, that she thought about Caleb differently than she had in October. That when she heard him come in from the morning check, the low sound of his boots on the porch, something in her chest did a small, involuntary thing she chose not to examine too closely. She was not naive about what this was. She had read enough novels, 60 of them within arm's reach, and she was working through them with a consistency that impressed even her to recognize the shape of it. What she was less certain about was what to do, because the situation was not simple, and she was not a person who pretended situations were simpler than they were. She had come here under arrangements that had nothing romantic about them. She had agreed to a marriage the way you agreed to a different road when the one you were on went nowhere. Not with enthusiasm, not with hope, but with the practical calculation of a person trying to survive. The fact that the road had turned out to be something other than she'd expected didn't retroactively change what the choice had been. And Caleb, she watched him, in the careful way she watched everything, gave her no pressure, no indication that he was waiting for anything. He was the same toward her in April as he had been in November, consistent, respectful, present without crowding. If he felt something beyond that, he kept it behind the same careful guard she had seen from the beginning, and she understood why. Because she understood now that he had spent 15 years hoping for something and had learned, as people who hope for a long time always learn, to keep the hoping separate from the demanding. It would have been easier in some ways if he'd been impatient. She knew how to handle impatient. She had spent 23 years managing a man's impatience. Caleb's steadiness was harder to navigate because it gave her nowhere to brace against. She was still thinking about this on the evening in late April when the storm changed everything. Thumped. The sky had been wrong all day. The kind of wrong that people who work outdoors learn to read the way some people read text, as a continuous narration of what's coming. A flat gray ceiling that came in low overnight and just sat there, pressurized, with a stillness in the air that was different from the ordinary stillness of cold. Thomas came in from the morning barn work and said, without preamble, "Bad one coming, maybe tonight." "How bad?" Caleb asked. "Can't tell yet. Bad enough." He poured himself coffee and looked at the window. "I want to get the calves into the lower barn before afternoon." They spent the morning doing exactly that, moving the early spring calves, a dozen of them, from the north pasture to the sheltered lower barn, which involved the particular combination of patience and strategic maneuvering that cattle work required. Clara helped drive them, which she had become reasonably competent at over the past weeks, working the flank with Thomas while Caleb handled the gate and the sorting. By noon, the sky had gone a darker gray and the temperature had dropped enough that their breath was visible again. By 3 in the afternoon, the first snow was coming, not lightly, not as a preliminary, but with the serious, committed weight of a late-season storm that had been saving itself. Thomas made his decision without discussion. "I'm staying in the barn tonight. Someone should be with the calves." "I'll relieve you at midnight," Caleb said. "We'll see," Thomas said, which meant he probably wouldn't be relieved, and both of them knew it. The barn door closed behind him. Caleb and Clara walked back to the house through snow that was already 3 inches deep and coming harder, and by the time they'd gotten their outer layers off and the fire rebuilt to a serious level, the wind had started in earnest. It was a different kind of night than the winter evenings they had shared. Those had been confined by cold, but not by emergency. A general stillness. The ranch turned inward. This was confinement of a different register. The storm threw itself against the house with an insistence that was almost personal, and the windows darkened completely, and the world outside reduced itself to sound. Wind, and more wind, and occasional deep groans from the trees at the ridge. Clara made supper. Beans and the last of the salt pork and cornbread, substantial and hot. And they ate at the table with the particular concentrated focus of people who have earned a meal through physical work. After she washed the dishes, and he dried them, which was not something they had done together before, and the small, ordinary domesticity of it felt strange in a way she couldn't quite place, like a word you've heard your whole life that you're suddenly hearing the meaning of for the first time. They sat by the fire. She had her book. He had a piece of tack he was oiling. The storm pushed and howled outside, and the fire worked steadily against it. And after perhaps an hour of this, Caleb set down the leather and said, "I want to tell you something." Clara closed her book around her thumb. "All right. I've been thinking about what I told you in February, about how I found you, about the bread and the sparrow." He paused. "I want to make sure you understand something I didn't say clearly enough." "What's that?" He looked at the fire, then at her. "I didn't come looking for you to collect a debt. I want to be clear about that. You gave me something when I had nothing, and I don't think of this—" He gestured, a brief motion that encompassed the house, the fire, the space between them. "As repayment. It was never meant to be an exchange." She studied him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've been watching you," he said, "and I think you're still waiting for the terms, for the thing I'm going to want from you that makes the rest of it make sense. The accounting." She was very still. "You're not wrong that I've been doing that," she said, finally. "I know." He said it without accusation. "I think it's how you learn to be in the world. I understand that. I'm not criticizing it." He paused. "But I want to say it plainly so you have it as something you've been told and not just something you're guessing at. There are no terms. You're not here to pay anything back. You're here because I wanted you to have somewhere to be that was yours." The fire crackled. A heavy gust hit the north wall of the house and the lamp guttered briefly. "Caleb," she said. Her voice came out differently than she intended, less steady. "What do you want?" "Not from the arrangement, from—" She stopped, tried again. "What are you hoping for?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer, and she was bracing herself for the deflection, the careful incompleteness he sometimes used when a question got too close. "I want you to be happy," he said. "Here." if that's possible. He looked at her directly. And I want, if you find that it's possible, for there to be more between us than arrangement. He stopped. I'm not asking for it. I'm not expecting it. I'm just telling you the truth of what I want, because you asked. The wind ran along the roof and the fire shifted and settled. I don't know yet, she said. Honest. I don't know what I feel. I know it's different than it was in October. I know that. She looked at her hands. I'm not good at this. I was never shown how this was supposed to work. Neither was I, he said. She looked up at him. You've been carrying that sparrow for 15 years. I'd say you've been doing something right. Something in his face changed. Not quite a smile, more the loosening of something that had been held for a long time. Carrying a bird in your pocket doesn't make you an expert, he said. She laughed. It came out before she'd planned it, a real laugh, short and surprised. And she saw the effect it had on him, saw something light up in his expression that he controlled quickly but not quickly enough. She looked at the fire. All right, she said more quietly. All right, what? All right, I'll stop waiting for the terms. She paused. It'll take some practice. Old habits. I know, he said. Take as long as you need. She opened her book again. He picked up the leather again. The storm did what storms do. Pushed and howled and eventually, in the way of all things with finite energy, began to exhaust itself toward morning. At some point in the late hours, when the wind had dropped from a roar to a complaint and the fire had settled to steady coals, Clara said, without looking up from her page, I remember now. The coat you were wearing, dark brown, patched at the shoulder. Silence. I wasn't sure if I remembered or if I'd constructed it, she said, but I think it's real. There was a patched shoulder. Yes, Caleb said. His voice was careful. That's right. She nodded, as though confirming something to herself, and turned the page. She didn't say anything more, and neither did he. But the thing that was in the room after that was different from the thing that had been in the room before, and they both knew it, and neither of them named it, and that was fine. She found the box on a Thursday in early May. She hadn't been looking for anything. She was reorganizing the storage shelf in the main room, making space for the spring supplies Thomas had brought back from his last town run. And she moved a stack of old ledgers to get at a section of the shelf behind them, and behind the ledgers, pushed to the very back and covered with a length of canvas, was a flat wooden box about the size of a large book. She would have left it. It wasn't hers, and she had enough respect for private things to leave them alone. But the canvas slipped when she moved the ledgers, and the box came partway off the shelf, and as she caught it, the latch, old, simple, not locked, gave, and the lid came open. She saw the contents before she could decide not to look. Letters, a thick stack of them, folded and refolded, some of them soft at the creases from handling. Not recent. The paper had the particular aged quality of things kept for years. On top of the stack, a newspaper cutting, folded in quarters, so old it had gone amber at the edges. And beneath everything else, a small card, the kind used for business correspondence, on which someone had written, in handwriting she didn't recognize, Haller Creek, Whitmore's General Store. Harold Whitmore, proprietor. Daughter, Clara, born 1863. She stood very still with the box in her hands. The handwriting on the card was not Caleb's. Someone else had written it. A town clerk, maybe, or whoever had answered his inquiry when he wrote to Haller Creek. It was a record. A piece of information gathered deliberately, kept deliberately, stored alongside 15 years of whatever else was in this box. She closed the lid. She put the box back where she found it, as close to how she'd found it as she could manage. She replaced the canvas and the ledgers. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at her hands. Daughter, Clara, born 1863. He had known her name for... she didn't know how long. Long enough for the card to yellow at the edges. Long enough for the edges of those letters to soften with handling. Long enough for the information to become not a clue, but a foundation. The first known measurement in the architecture of a plan that had taken years to execute. She heard his boots on the porch. She had approximately 15 seconds to decide what to do with her face, and she was still deciding when the door opened and he came in, bringing cold air and the smell of horses and the particular quality of presence that she realized, become entirely accustomed to over the past months. He looked at her. He was good at reading her. She had come to understand that he paid the same quality of attention to her that he paid to the weather and the cattle and the fence lines. Not obsessively, not with the intensity of surveillance, but with the steady, comprehensive awareness of someone for whom the relevant data actually mattered. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." A beat. "I was reorganizing the storage shelf." His eyes went briefly to the shelf, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression. A small stillness, the kind that precedes rather than follows. "The box," he said. Not a question. "The latch came open. I wasn't trying to—" "I know," he said. He set his hat on the peg and crossed to the table and sat down, which was what he did when he was preparing to say something that required saying properly. She stayed where she was. "What did you see?" he asked. "Letters, a newspaper cutting, a card." She paused. "With my name on it, my birth year." He looked at the table, nodded once. "How long have you known—" "The card. How long had you had that?" "About 12 years, he said. "I sent an inquiry to the town when I had the money saved to start buying land. I wanted to know—" He stopped. "I wanted to know if you were still there, still unmarried." The reply just said the proprietor's daughter was unmarried, gave her year of birth. He looked up at her. "I didn't write again until I was in a position to do something about what I knew." "The letters," she said. "Who are they from?" A pause. "I wrote them," he said. "To you. Over the years." He held her gaze. "I never sent them. I knew I couldn't. You were a stranger to me. I had no standing to write to you. It would have been—" He stopped. "I wrote them anyway, when things happened that I wanted to tell someone, when I had a bad season and almost lost the herd, when I found this valley, when I finished the house." He looked at the shelf. "It was a private foolishness. I didn't expect anyone to see them." Clara stared at him. She felt something happening in her chest. A pressure, not painful, the kind that happens when something that has been compressed very tightly is given room to expand. "You wrote me letters for 12 years, she said. "Yes." "Without sending them?" "Yes." "Caleb." Her voice had gone somewhere she hadn't planned for it to go. "That is the most— I don't know if that's the most devoted thing I've ever heard, or the saddest." He looked at her steadily. "Maybe both," he said. She moved to the table and sat down across from him. She put her hands flat on the wood between them and looked at them and then looked at him. "Can I read them?" she asked. "Someday. Not now, but can I?" Something moved through his expression that she had never seen on his face before. The unmistakable relief of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. "Yes," he said, "if you want to." "I want to," she said. Outside, the spring wind moved through the valley. Not the brutal winter wind, not the storm wind, but the softer, more purposeful wind of a season in transition, carrying the smell of new grass and creek water and the very faint possibility of warmth. Clara sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the man across from her who had spent 15 years writing letters to a woman he'd met for 30 seconds. And she thought about all the ways a person could love someone from a distance without it becoming something that ate them alive. And she thought, this man is not like anyone I have ever known. And then because she was still herself, still cautious, still careful, still a person who had learned very young the cost of reaching for things that might not be there, she thought, I need to be sure. Before I move toward this, I need to be sure what I'm moving toward. She was not yet sure, but she was closer than she'd been the night before, and further than she'd expected to get, and she thought that was probably enough for one spring afternoon. She got up and went to start supper. He picked up his hat and went back out to finish the evening checks. The house settled around her. The familiar sounds of it, the creak of the boards, the draft around the north window she'd been meaning to mention, the particular rhythm of a place that had been waiting for people to fill it, and she moved through it with a competence that had once surprised her and no longer did. "You're going to be all right here," Thomas had told her. She was beginning to believe it. And the blizzard came in the third week of May, which everyone who knew Montana high country accepted as the kind of thing that happened and could not be predicted with any reliability, but which still arrived with the quality of an insult. The grass had been up for 3 weeks. The calves were out on the pasture. Clara had seedlings started in the kitchen window that she was waiting to transplant. Then 2 feet of wet, heavy snow in 18 hours. Thomas, who had seen worse, handled it with characteristic equanimity. He moved the calves back in, secured the barn, and informed them at breakfast on the first morning of the storm that he would be managing the livestock, and they should not come out to help, because 2 people in a blizzard was plenty, and 4 was 4 times the chance of something going wrong. So they were confined to the house. This was different from the January storm. January had been early in the story. She had still been new here, still calibrating, still keeping the careful distance of a person who has not yet decided how much to trust a situation. Now it was May, and she knew where the loose floorboard was in the hall upstairs, and she knew how he took his coffee, and she had read 11 of his 60 books and argued with him about 2 of them, and she had driven fence posts with him in freezing mud and shoveled out the barn door after the February drifts and heard him laugh exactly 4 times. Confinement with a person you have stopped being afraid of is a different condition than confinement with a stranger. They cooked together in the morning. She made the bread, he made the eggs. They occupied the kitchen with an ease that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. After breakfast he read, and she worked on a length of mending she'd been putting off. By afternoon, restless from inactivity, she went looking for something more demanding and found herself standing at the storage shelf with a cloth, cleaning the ledgers. Her hand found the canvas. She stopped. She stood there for a moment. Then she lifted the canvas and took out the box and set it on the table. "Caleb," she said. He looked up from his book. "Can we talk about this properly?" She put her hand on the lid. "All of it. Not just the parts you've told me already, the parts you left out." He closed the book. He crossed to the table and sat down, and she sat across from him, and the box was between them, and the storm was outside, and the fire was going, and she thought, "This is the moment. Whatever comes next comes from this." She opened the lid. She looked at the letters. 12 years of them, she now knew, folded and refolded and handled enough to go soft at the creases. She did not pick them up. She looked at the newspaper cutting and then at him. "What is this?" she asked, lifting the cutting carefully. "Land notice," he said, "from the Helena paper, announcing the filing on this valley, the first time I saw my own name attached to something worth having." He paused. "I kept it." She set it down. She looked at the card with her name on it. She looked at him. "Tell me the parts you haven't told me," she said. "Not because I think you're hiding something damaging, because I want to understand the whole of it." He looked at the box for a moment, then at her. And then, slowly and without rehearsal, he did. He told her about the years after Howler Creek, the winters working cattle drives and laying track and doing whatever work was available. The foreman in Wyoming who had been decent to him and taught him what he knew about range management, and how that man's death from a fall had left him with his small wages and a set of knowledge that turned out to be worth more than the wages. He told her about arriving in Montana, about the valley and the way it had looked the first time he'd ridden down into it in autumn, and how he had known immediately and with a certainty that was unusual for him that this was the place. He told her about the letters, not the content, that he left to her for whenever she was ready, but the habit of them. How they had started as a way of thinking through his days when there was no one to talk to, how they had become something else over time, a record, a conversation with someone who was not there, but whose imagined presence had kept him company in a way nothing else quite had. He was not, she noticed, making it into a romantic story. He told it the way he told everything, plainly, with the occasional hesitation of a man who is trying to be precise rather than impressive. He told her where he'd been wrong and where he'd been uncertain, and the stretches of years where the whole project had seemed like a kind of madness. "Did you ever think about stopping?" she asked. "About just living your life without the plan, finding someone closer?" "Yes," he said. "Twice." He paused. "The first time was about 8 years in, when I thought I was probably being an idiot. I was 30. There was a woman in the town near here, widowed, capable. We got along well enough." He stopped. "What happened?" "Nothing dramatic. We spent some time together, and it was fine, pleasant. She deserved someone who was fully there, and I wasn't." He looked at the box. "I ended it as gently as I could. I don't know if I did it gently enough." "The second time?" 2 years ago. Similar situation. Similar conclusion. He looked at Clara directly. I want you to know this because I want to be honest about the fact that I'm not a man who's been pure and singular in his dedication. I'm a man who tried twice to be practical and couldn't manage it all the way through. She considered this. That makes you more believable, she said. Not less. He looked surprised, genuinely, briefly surprised, and she thought, he didn't expect that. You thought I'd be bothered, she said. Most people would be. Most people haven't been sold to a stranger, she said. I'm not in a position to hold up a standard of romantic purity. I was standing in front of the justice of the peace telling a man I'd met twice that I'd marry him. She paused. We're both working with imperfect materials. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. Yes, he said. We are. Outside the storm made its demands, and the fire answered. Clara looked at the stack of letters in the box and thought about 12 years of words written to her by a man who hadn't known her and had thought about her anyway. She thought about all the years she had spent in those back rooms behind her father's store, growing smaller by degrees, and she thought about what it meant that someone had been carrying a version of her, an imagined her, a hoped for her, as an alternative to shrinking. I want to say something, she said. Say it. I don't know yet if what I feel is... She stopped. Started again. I'm not going to say anything I don't mean, but I want you to know that I came here expecting to endure this, and I'm not enduring it. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. No, he said. His voice had gone quiet. It isn't. She closed the lid of the box. She left it on the table between them, not hidden away, not put back, just there, a thing that had been acknowledged. I'd like to read the first one, she said. If you don't mind, sometime this week. Whenever you want, he said. She nodded. She got up to make coffee because that was what you did when a conversation had taken you somewhere large and you needed a moment with your hands occupied. He watched her move to the stove, and she could feel the quality of it, the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, which she always noticed. She had just chosen not to name it. She named it now, internally, standing at the stove with her back to him. He loves you. He has probably loved the idea of you for 15 years and the reality of you for 5 months, and he is waiting to know what you're going to do about that. She didn't know yet, but the storm held them together in the house through 2 more days and 2 more long evenings by the fire, and the letters sat in the box on the table. And on the second evening, she reached over and took the top letter from the stack and unfolded it, and he watched her read it without saying anything, and what was in it she kept to herself. But when she finished, she folded it back along its worn creases and set it on top of the stack and looked at the fire, and something in her face had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them said a word, and that was its own kind of answer. She read all 12 years of letters over the course of 2 weeks, not in a rush. She was not a person who rushed through things that mattered, and these mattered in a way she was still trying to fully measure. She took 1 or 2 at a time, in the evenings after supper when the day's work had settled and the house had gone quiet, and she read them by the lamp with the same careful attention she brought to everything she decided was worth her time. They were not love letters exactly. That was the first thing she noticed, and it was the thing that made them more affecting rather than less. They did not perform. They did not reach for language larger than the occasion warranted. They were the letters of a man writing to someone he thought of as real, talking about the condition of the south pasture after a hard August, about a horse he'd bought and lost to colic the following spring, about a book he'd read twice because the first time hadn't been enough. They were the letters of a person who had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that someone deserved to be talked to as though they were present. In the 8th letter, dated roughly 6 years back, the handwriting slightly more settled than the earlier ones, the paper a better quality, which told her something about how his circumstances had changed. He wrote about finishing the house framing. He wrote, I stood on the porch this evening and watched the sun go down behind the ridge and thought about what it would be like to have someone to stand there with. I'm not sure this is a sensible thing to build a life around. I've decided I don't particularly care whether it's sensible. She folded that one back very carefully and held it in her lap for a while before she set it down. Caleb did not ask her about the letters. He did not hover or watch for her reactions, which she appreciated deeply, because any hovering would have made her close off in a way that would have been hard to reverse. He simply continued being the person he was, consistent, present, unhurried, and trusted her to bring whatever she found back to him in her own time. She was still working out how to do that, how to move towards something without losing the footing she'd built so carefully in the months since October. It was, she understood, not a simple calculation. You could not spend 23 years learning that reaching for things led to disappointment and then simply unlearn it in one good winter. The habit ran deeper than will, but she was trying. That was also new. Well, June arrived warm and legitimate, without May's reversals, and the ranch entered a season of sustained and demanding work that left everyone tired by evening and gave Clara less time to think, which was sometimes a relief. The seasonal hands arrived in the first week. Two brothers named Adler, Pete, and Frank, from over near Billings, who had worked the ranch for the previous 2 summers, and who greeted Caleb with the easy shorthand of men who have shared hard work, and greeted Clara with a courteous uncertainty that told her they hadn't known what to expect but were willing to be corrected by evidence. She gave them evidence fairly quickly. On the 3rd day, when the east pasture fence repair that she and Caleb had planned in March finally got underway in earnest, she worked alongside the crew for the full morning, driving posts, pulling wire, making the diagonal brace adjustments that she had now done enough times to execute without being shown. By noon, Pete Adler had stopped glancing at her to see if she needed help she hadn't asked for, and by the end of the day, Frank said, "At the water bucket, you've done fence work before." And she said, "I've done this fence before." And he nodded once, and that was the end of the uncertainty. Thomas watched all of this without comment, which was his version of vigorous approval. The work was good for her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had always worked. Her whole life had been work, the store and the ledgers and the cleaning and the cooking. But it had always been work in service of something that wasn't hers, in a space that didn't belong to her, building toward nothing she could see the shape of. This work built toward things she could see and touch: the fence that would hold the cattle, the garden that would feed them through winter, the ranch that was, she had slowly and somewhat fiercely come to understand, as much hers as it was his. She had been added to the land deed in March, quietly, without ceremony. Caleb had set the document on the table one evening and said, "This should have been done at the start. I'm sorry it took me this long." And she had looked at her name on the paper next to his for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing that wasn't too large or too small for that moment. She thought about the deed sometimes while she was working. Clara Whitmore Mercer, right-hand portion of the page. It still startled her slightly. She was working on letting it not. She did not expect the wagon. It was a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of June, warm enough that she had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, working in the kitchen garden where the beans were finally climbing their stakes, and the tomato plant she'd started in the kitchen window had gone into the ground with more confidence than she'd felt in putting them there. She heard the approach before she saw it, the sound of a wagon on the ranch road, which was not unusual, but something in the particular rhythm of it, the pace of it, pulled her attention upward. She stood and pushed her hair back from her face and looked. The wagon that came down the ranch road was not Thomas's. It was a lighter rig, a single horse, and the figure on the seat was not a figure she had seen in 8 months, but was one she recognized without having to think about it, the way you recognize certain shapes that were part of the landscape of your formation. Harold Whitmore. She stood very still in the kitchen garden with dirt on her hands and watched him come. He had not written to tell her he was coming. He had not asked. He had simply come, the way he had always done things, without consulting the people most affected by them, on the assumption that his own judgment was sufficient. Some things, apparently, did not change. She watched him pull up near the house and climb down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man who had spent 2 days riding and felt it in his joints. He was wearing his town coat, which was too heavy for the weather, and he had the leather satchel he used for important business, which told her this was not a social call and had not been intended to resemble one. She set down her gardening tool and walked toward the house. She did not rush. He saw her when she was about 30 feet out. His expression went through several calculations quickly. She had always been able to see when her father was calculating, though she had not always been able to read the outcome, and then settled into something that was almost paternal, almost warm. She knew that register. It meant he wanted something. "Clara," he said. "Father." She stopped a few feet from him. "You didn't write." "I was in the area," he said, which was so transparently untrue. Blackstone Ridge was not on the way to anywhere you'd end up by accident. that she simply let it sit there. Thought I'd see how you were getting on. I'm getting on well, she said. You're welcome to water your horse at the trough. I'll tell Caleb you're here. She went inside and found Caleb at the workbench in the back room, sorting hardware. She stood in the doorway. My father's here, she said. He set down what he was holding. He looked at her face, reading it the way he read all important things, carefully and without rushing. Are you all right? He asked. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I want to know what he wants before I decide. He nodded. Do you want me there? Yes, she said, and the quickness of it surprised her slightly. Yes, I do. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, with coffee that Clara made because she needed something to do with her hands, and because offering hospitality was a way of maintaining the position of host rather than ceding it. Harold Whitmore sat across from his daughter and looked around the kitchen with an expression that was half assessment and half something she couldn't immediately name. You've done well here, he said, addressing this to somewhere between them rather than to either specifically. Yes, Clara said, we have. Caleb sat slightly to her left and slightly back, present, available, not inserting himself. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the fire in winter, a source of warmth she had learned to trust as consistent. Her father wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and looked at Clara directly. The store's had a difficult winter, he said. Supply costs up, fewer travelers on the road since they rerouted the stage line. I'm sorry to hear that, Clara said. She meant it, more or less. She was not sorry enough to miss what was coming, but she was not made of stone either. I may need to make some adjustments, Harold continued. Restructure some things. He paused. The agreement with Mr. Mercer, there was a financial component, an amount settled on the occasion of the marriage. I know, Clara said. I know what I was sold for. The flatness of it landed in the room. Her father's jaw tightened briefly. That's not... Clara, that's an uncharitable. It's an accurate description, she said. You negotiated a price and I was transferred. I'm not angry about it anymore, but I'm also not going to pretend it was something else. She held his gaze. What are you asking for? Harold Whitmore was silent for a moment. He looked at Caleb, not quite asking for help, but looking for an opening. Caleb met his eyes and offered nothing. There's a second amount, Harold said. Contingent. Part of the original arrangement. If the marriage proved successful, lasting past 1 year, an additional payment was agreed to. I'm here to discuss the timing of that. Clara looked at him. Is that in the document Caleb signed? A beat. It was discussed verbally. Is it in the document? She said again. The silence that followed was its own answer. She turned to Caleb. Was there a contingent amount discussed? No, Caleb said. Simple, direct, without heat. The agreement was complete as written. There was no second payment. She turned back to her father. Harold Whitmore had the expression of a man who had tried a door and found it locked, and was now deciding whether to try the window. She knew that expression. She had watched it her entire childhood, the recalibration, the pivot, the search for another angle. Times are genuinely difficult, he said, shifting to something that was closer to honest. The store, I'm not exaggerating when I say, I believe you, Clara said. I believe the store is struggling. That's a real problem, and I don't dismiss it. She put her hands flat on the table. But I'm not going to fix it for you by inventing an obligation that doesn't exist. And I'm not going to ask my husband to pay something he doesn't owe because you drove 2 days hoping I'd be too uncomfortable to say no to you directly. The words came out steadier than she'd expected. 8 months ago, even 4 months ago, she would not have been able to say them. Not because she wouldn't have thought them, but because the gap between thinking something true and saying it to her father's face had always seemed unbridgeable. The bridge had been built slowly, in the months at Blackstone Ridge, from materials she hadn't known she was accumulating. Harold Whitmore looked at his daughter. She looked back. There was a long moment. She could see him working through the possibilities, pressure, sympathy, authority, and she could see each one fail before he tried it, because he was, beneath everything, a man who knew when a position was lost, and she was no longer a position that could be held. You've changed, he said finally. There was something in it that was not entirely criticism. Yes, she said, I have. He looked at the table, he looked at his coffee. Some of the structured bearing went out of his shoulders, not completely, not into anything that resembled real remorse, but into something more honest than the performance he'd come in with. The store really is struggling, he said, quieter. Then sell it, she said, not cruelly. You've been running it alone for 20 years and you're not a young man. Sell it and go somewhere that suits you better. The world is bigger than Howler Creek. He looked at her as though she'd suggested something vaguely inconceivable. The store it's been in the family. It was never mine, she said. I worked it for 6 years for nothing, and it was never mine. Don't use the word family to me about that store. She paused. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and I think you know it. The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window, she could hear the summer sounds of the ranch. Somewhere distant, Thomas calling to one of the Adler brothers about something. The ordinary background noise of a place in full working life. Caleb had not said a word through any of this. He had not needed to. His presence was not the presence of someone intervening or protecting. It was the presence of someone who trusted her to handle her own territory and was simply there if she needed him. She had not known, until this moment, how different that felt from every other way she had ever been in a room with men. I should have done better by you, Harold Whitmore said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, at his hands on the mug, with the expression of a man who has arrived at an admission sideways and is not entirely sure how he got there. He did not elaborate. He did not build it into a full reckoning, did not lay out the inventory of failures or ask for forgiveness. He said the one true thing and left it at the level of one true thing, which was, she supposed, the most he knew how to give. She thought about whether it was enough. She turned it over honestly, the way she had learned to turn things over here rather than reaching for the first available response. I know, she said finally. I know you should have. He nodded. Once. The conversation moved to smaller things after that. The drive up, the state of the road, the ranch in ways that were more genuine than his opening assessment had been. She refilled his coffee. He asked about the cattle operation with what seemed like actual curiosity. Caleb answered directly and without performance, treating Harold with the same level and consistent respect he treated everyone, which she noticed and which seemed to unsettle her father in a way that was probably good for him. He stayed 2 hours. When he rose to leave, he put on his coat at the door and looked at Clara with an expression she didn't have a full name for. Something that mixed regret and pride and the discomfort of a man who has been shown a version of his daughter he didn't build and can't take credit for. You look well, he said. I am well, she said. He looked at Caleb briefly. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but an acknowledgement. Man to man, the recognition of a thing done right. Then he went out to his wagon. Clara stood on the porch and watched him go. She watched the wagon move down the ranch road, through the gate, onto the track that would take him back toward the main road, and then the long 2-day drive to Howler Creek. She stood there until the wagon was out of sight. Caleb came to stand beside her. Not touching, just beside her, in the easy way of people who have learned each other's proximity. You all right? He asked. Yes, she said. She considered it further. Surprisingly, yes. You didn't have to do that alone. I know, she said. But it needed to be mine. She looked at the empty road. He's not a monster. He's just a man who took the easiest path every time there was a choice, and the easiest path with me was always to subtract. She paused. I don't think he knew what it cost. People rarely do, Caleb said, when they're the one spending someone else's currency. She turned and looked at him. He was watching the empty road, the clean line of his profile against the bright June sky, and she thought about the letter, the 8th one, the one about standing on the porch watching the sunset, and she thought about everything he had built here out of an act of ordinary decency that she didn't even remember. Caleb, she said. I've been thinking about something. He looked at her. When I came here, she said, I told you I wasn't coming because I had hope, that I was just choosing a different road because the old one went nowhere. She paused. I want to tell you that's not the whole truth anymore. He was very still. I'm not going to make a speech about it, she said. I don't do speeches. But I wanted you to know that it's different now. What I feel about being here. She held his gaze. What I feel about you. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing that thing she had learned to read, the hoping, held carefully back from leaning. You don't have to, he started. I know I don't have to, she said. That's the point. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to have it said. He was quiet. Okay, he said finally. It came out slightly rough. He cleared his throat. All right. That's your response? She said. I'm working on a better one, he said. She almost smiled. Take your time. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any flourish, just closed his fingers around hers in the plain and unhurried way he did everything and held on. She did not pull away. They stood on the porch of the house he had built for her and looked out at the valley in the June afternoon, and the ranch went on around them with all of its ordinary demands and sounds and continuous life, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something is actually yours. Not given, not arranged, not traded. Hers. Built toward, claimed, inhabited. She held his hand and watched the summer light move across the grass. Behind them, through the open door, she could see the wooden sparrow on the shelf near the fire, small and pale, worn smooth by 15 years of being carried, now settled in a home that had been built around its return. She had spent her entire life being told she was a weight someone else had to carry. She was beginning to understand that this was not a fact. It had never been a fact. It had been her father's story, told so many times and so early that she had accepted it as the truth of things, the way children accept the truth their parents give them before they are old enough to ask for evidence. There was no evidence. There had only ever been the evidence of a man who kept a small wooden bird for 15 years and drove 60 miles to answer a question Harold Whitmore had spent 2 decades trying to convince her nobody was asking. She was not a burden. She had never been. She was standing on her own porch in the middle of her own life, and the man beside her had chosen her, specifically, deliberately, across 15 years and hundreds of miles and 2 honest attempts to do otherwise, and her father was a small wagon on a long road going back to a place that no longer held her. She was still figuring out what to do with all of that. She expected it would take some time. She was not in a hurry. The summer had a long way to go, and so did she. The summer after Harold Whitmore's visit was the first season Clara had ever lived without looking over her shoulder. She noticed it the way you notice a sound that has stopped, not during the sound, but in the absence of it, when the silence arrives and you realize how constantly you had been bracing against the noise. The bracing had been so habitual, so thoroughly woven into the way she moved through each day, that she hadn't recognized it as bracing at all. She had thought it was simply how a person was, how she was. The permanent low-level vigilance of a woman who had learned very young that the floor could shift without warning and that the only protection was to stay ready. The floor had stopped shifting. She was still getting used to standing on something solid. July at Blackstone Ridge was full and demanding, and in a way she had no prior experience of, genuinely satisfying. The garden she had expanded into the south plot was producing with the particular generosity of ground that has been properly prepared. Beans climbing their stakes, the tomatoes finally red after weeks of anxious green, a row of squash that had taken over more space than she'd planned, and that she harvested with a mixture of exasperation and pride. She learned to preserve properly, something she had known only in theory from the store's supply of canning jars, and she and Thomas had a brief but pointed disagreement about the correct method for preserving the early tomatoes that Thomas won, on the grounds that he had done it for 30 years, and she conceded with moderate grace. She did not concede easily. This was something she had discovered about herself at Blackstone Ridge, that underneath the careful, managed smallness she had cultivated for 23 years was a person with opinions and with the particular stubbornness of someone who had been overridden so many times that the stubbornness had become structural. She had been afraid, when she first noticed it, that it would be a problem, that she would argue too much, push too hard, make herself difficult in ways that damaged the fragile thing they were building. What she found instead was that Caleb met her stubbornness with the equanimity he brought to everything, and that occasionally he pushed back with a quiet firmness of his own, and that the result was not damage but something more like a real conversation, the kind between people who take each other seriously enough to disagree. She had not had that before. She was clumsy at it sometimes. She said things more bluntly than she intended and had to learn the difference between honest and needlessly sharp. She got things wrong. Once, in early August, she was so convinced she was right about the timing of the second hay cutting that she argued past the point of her own evidence and into the territory of pure stubbornness. And Caleb said, calmly and without satisfaction, "You know you're wrong." And she said, "I know." And that was the whole resolution of it. No aftermath, no residue, just the simple acknowledgement and then on to the next thing. She had never had a disagreement resolved that cleanly in her life. She was still surprised by it. She kept waiting for the invoice, the point where the small conflicts accumulated into something that was held against her. It didn't come. She was beginning to believe, not all the way, not with the full weight of her body on it, but beginning, that it wasn't going to. She finished reading the letters in late July. She had taken her time with them, as she had said she would, returning to them in the evenings when the mood was right and leaving them alone when it wasn't. Some of them she read twice. The early ones, raw with the uncertainty of a young man who wasn't sure what he was doing or whether it made sense, she found hardest to read without feeling something that was almost physical, a tenderness for the person he had been before she knew him. The later ones, settled and wry and written with the confidence of a man who had made peace with his own strangeness, she loved in a different way, more familiar, because she recognized in them the person she had come to know. The last letter was dated 14 months ago, written on a night in April of the previous year, 3 weeks before he had sent his inquiry to Haller Creek and Harold Whitmore had called his daughter into the storeroom. It read, in its entirety, "I think I'm going to do it. I've said that before and then found reasons not to. But I'm 35 years old and the valley is as good as it's going to be. And I've been working up to this for long enough that not doing it feels like the worst kind of cowardice. She probably doesn't think of me at all. She may not even remember. I'm aware that this could go very wrong in any number of ways. I'm going anyway. If you're reading this, Clara, which I suppose is possible, the fact that you're reading it means at least something went right." She folded it back along its worn creases. She sat with it in her lap for a while. Then she went downstairs and found Caleb at the workbench and said, without preamble, "I finished the letters." He looked up. "All right." "The last one," she said. "You wrote that you were going to do it, that not doing it felt like the worst kind of cowardice." He held her gaze. "Yes. I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I'm glad you were a coward for long enough that I had time to be miserable in Haller Creek and then not a coward anymore. Because I think if you'd come sooner, I wouldn't have been ready." He was quiet for a moment. "Ready for what?" "For this," she said. "For any of it. For being somewhere that was mine and someone that was—" She stopped. She was not a person who found these words easily, and she had decided that was all right, that the difficulty itself was honest, that struggling to say a true thing was more real than saying an easy one. "Someone I chose," she said. "That part. I needed to be ready for that." Something in him loosened. She could see it, the way his shoulders dropped very slightly, the particular quality of a long-held breath released. "You're not the only one who needed time," he said. "I know," she said. 12 years of letters is a particular kind of preparation." He almost smiled. "I wasn't prepared," he said. "I thought I was. I had the house and the land and the plan. I had no idea what I was actually walking into." She looked at him. "What were you walking into?" He met her eyes. "Someone considerably more than I had imagined," he said. "And I had imagined fairly thoroughly." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something in the air between them had shifted since her father's visit, since the afternoon on the porch when she had told him what she felt and he had taken her hand. And they had both been careful with the shift, neither of them reaching for it too fast or too hard. But careful and still were different things, and she was done being still. "Caleb," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "When we married," she said, "it was an arrangement. You know that and I know that, and we've both been honest about what it was." She paused. "I want to do it again." He went very still. "Not the paperwork," she said quickly. The paper is fine. The paper exists. I mean—" She stopped and pressed her hands against the sides of her legs, which was what she did when she was frustrated at her own inadequacy with language. "I mean, I want to stand somewhere with you and say that I'm here because I want to be here. Not because I had no better option. Not because you built something I couldn't refuse. She looked at him directly. Because I choose it. You, all of this. And I want you to know that I chose it with the full use of my faculties, without any arrangement compelling me. He looked at her for a long time. You're asking me to marry you, he said. I'm asking you to let me marry you, she said. The first time you married me. This time I want it to go the other direction. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, the large, careful hands she had watched do hard work all winter and spring. And he kissed her, which was the first time, and it was not perfectly executed because neither of them had much recent practice, and there was a slightly awkward moment of navigation, and she laughed against his mouth, and he said, "Give me a moment," in a rough, slightly embarrassed voice that made her laugh again, and then it was better. And then it was quite a lot better than that. And the workbench was behind her, and neither of them were particularly thinking about it. When they separated, she was still laughing, and he was trying not to, and failing. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes." "Obviously," she repeated. "Did you think I was going to say no?" "No," she admitted, "but I wanted to ask anyway." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized now. She had a name for it finally, after 8 months of trying to identify it. It was the face of a man who can't quite believe his own luck and is afraid to count on it too heavily and is counting on it anyway. She understood that face. She was wearing something like it herself. They did not make a ceremony of it. She had considered whether she wanted one, had turned the question over in the late summer evenings while the light went long and golden over the ridge, and had decided that she did not want an audience, did not want the formality, did not want to reconstruct anything that resembled the original arrangement in the Justice of the Peace's tobacco-scented office. What she wanted was to say it in a place that was theirs. On a Saturday afternoon in the last week of August, she told Thomas and the Adler brothers that the afternoon was their own, which produced from Thomas a single raised eyebrow, and from the Adler brothers a cooperative absence without questions. She and Caleb walked out to the south end of the valley, past the kitchen garden and the new fence line and the creek crossing, to a place she had found in the spring during one of her morning walks. A wide, grassy bench on the slope above the creek where the angle of the land gave you a clear view of the whole valley and the ridge beyond and the enormous open sky above it all. She had not told him where they were going. He had not asked. They sat in the grass, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the valley below them. The creek catching the afternoon light, the cattle grazing in the east pasture, the house with its porch and garden and solid roof, all of it laid out below like a map of the last 8 months. "I want to say some things," Clara said. "All right," he said. She had thought about what she wanted to say. She was not a person who felt easy making declarations. The habit of smallness died hard. The old instinct that too much wanting, too much claiming, attracted punishment. But she had written it down once, privately, in the back of one of her father's old account books that she'd brought with her from Haller Creek, and she had read it until it was part of her, and now she said it. "I came here with nothing I wanted to keep," she said. "Not because I had nothing, but because everything I had was shaped by someone else's idea of what I was worth. I came here and I found something different, and it took me time to trust it, and I'm not going to pretend that trust is complete even now. I still check sometimes, still look for the edge." She paused. "But I'm here. I'm here because the life we are building is more real and more mine than anything I had before. And because you're the only person who looked at me and didn't decide first what I was and then look for evidence. You just looked." He was watching her with that expression. She let him. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you. And I need you to know that it's not out of obligation or gratitude or the absence of alternatives. It's because I look too, and what I found is worth choosing." The valley stretched below them. The light was starting to angle, beginning the long August descent toward evening. A hawk was making slow circles above the creek, and the grass bent and recovered in a light wind, and the mountains in the north sat where they always sat, steady and enormous and indifferent to everything except their own geology. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful with the weight of what it was carrying. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Not without people, Thomas. The seasonal hands, neighbors occasionally, but alone in the way that matters. The way where there's nobody who knows the whole of it, nobody who sees all the parts and stays anyway. He paused. I got accustomed to that. I told myself it was fine, that I was built for it, that some people are and some people aren't, and I was one who was. He looked at her. You have made that very hard to keep believing. Good, she said. I didn't finish, he said. Sorry, she said. Go on. The corner of his mouth moved. I want you to know that every version of this I imagined, every letter I wrote, every plan I made, fell short of what you actually are. Not because I couldn't have done better with more information, because you're more than the sum of what can be known about you in advance. Ah? He paused. You're more than the girl in the store who was already enough to carry for 15 years. You are something I couldn't have planned for, and I was the one who thought he was planning. She looked at the valley. She felt the weight of what had just been said, and she did not rush past it, did not reach for a deflection or a joke. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with things here, fully, without flinching. Then we're agreed, she said. We're agreed, he said. He had brought the rings. He had not said he was going to. She discovered them when he reached into his coat pocket and produced them, and she saw that he had a new one for her, thinner than the original, with a small detail worked into the band that was not quite a pattern and not quite a carving, something that suggested rather than stated. She looked at it in his palm. The other one is still good, she said. I know, he said. This one is different. He paused. I had it made in the spring. She looked up at him. You had it made in the spring. I was hoping, he said simply. She took the ring from his palm and held it for a moment, then slid it onto her finger herself, which was not how it was usually done and which felt exactly right. He kept the original band. He had worn it since October, a plain gold thing that he hadn't made any speeches about, and she took it from his hand briefly and put it back, which made something in his expression go quietly, profoundly undone. Keep it, she said. He nodded. He couldn't, in that moment, say anything. She understood. She wasn't sure she could either. They sat on the hillside in the August afternoon, and the valley went on below them and the sky went on above them, and neither of them spoke for a while. And it was not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said the thing that mattered and are letting it settle into the ground. September came, and the rhythm of the ranch shifted into the particular tempo of a place preparing for winter. Not the scramble of panic, but the steady, purposeful work of people who know what's coming and intend to be ready for it. The hay was cut and baled and stored. The root cellar was stocked with more discipline than the previous year because she had a full year's data now on what they actually used and what they had over-optimistic about. The cattle were checked and sorted, and the ones to be sold in the fall brought to a state of readiness. Thomas handled much of this with his usual comprehensive competence, and Pete and Frank Adler worked through their last weeks of the season with the knowledge of men wrapping up something they'd be glad to return to. On their last day, Frank Adler said to Clara, at the water bucket, "You've changed the place." And she said, "Is that good?" And he said, "It's better," and went back to work, which she found, coming from Frank Adler, more than sufficient. When the Adler brothers left and Thomas retreated to his comfortable minimalism, Blackstone Ridge contracted back to the three of them. Her, Caleb, Thomas, which was the form it took in winter and which Clara had come to think of as its true shape, the version of it that was most itself. She was most herself here too. That was the thing she kept coming back to, through October's return and the first snows of the new season dusting the ridge. She was most herself here in a way she had not been in Holler Creek, because in Holler Creek there had been no room for herself, only for the version of her that took up the least space and caused the least disruption. Here she took up space. Here she caused disruption occasionally, and the disruption did not become catastrophe. Here she had opinions and plans, and the freedom to be wrong without it becoming a verdict on her worth. She planted roses in October. This was not practical. Roses were not practical in Montana at any time of year, and planting them in October meant protecting them through the winter in ways that required actual work and could easily fail. But she had been thinking about it since the spring, since the conversation with her father in the afternoon on the porch, since something had unlocked in her understanding of what she was doing here and what she had the right to reach for. Her mother had grown roses in a small patch behind the store that no one tended after she died, and that gradually went to scrub. Clara had a memory of them, red and very fragrant, and the specific quality of her mother's expression when she was among them, which was the closest thing to unguarded that Clara had ever seen on Ruth Whitmore's face. She dug the beds on the south side of the house, in the warmth-holding angle between the house wall and the garden fence, which gave the best chance of survival. She worked the soil the same way she had worked the vegetable beds in spring, with the systematic patience of someone who has decided the outcome is worth the effort. She set the rootstock deep, the way the manual she'd ordered from Thomas's last town run instructed, and she mulched heavily, and she made no promises to herself about the outcome. Caleb watched from the porch for a while on the first afternoon. Then he came down and crouched beside her. "What kind?" he asked. "A climbing variety?" she said. "They'll need something to grow against. I was thinking we could put up a trellis along this section of the wall." "I can do that before the ground freezes," he said. He looked at the bed she'd prepared. "This is going to be a lot of work over the winter." "I know," she said. "What made you decide on roses?" She sat back on her heels and looked at the turned earth. She thought about her mother at the window. She thought about the wooden sparrow, which sat now in a permanent place on the kitchen shelf, worn and small and unchanged. She thought about the account book in which she had written the things she said to Caleb on the hill in August, which she had kept, which was the first record she had ever made of her own interior life that she had not then hidden or destroyed. "Because they're difficult," she said, "and because they bloom anyway, and because I think I've earned something beautiful that isn't useful." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "you have." He built the trellis on a Saturday in mid-October, working with the methodical precision she had come to know as simply how he did things. Not rushing, not cutting corners, doing it in a way that would last. She brought him coffee and stood beside the half-finished structure and looked at the lines of it against the house wall and thought, next summer there will be roses here. She had not thought in next summers for most of her life. She had thought in endurances. Next winter, next season of difficulty, next period to get through. The shift from endurance to anticipation was not complete and was not simple, and she did not expect it to be. Some of the old thinking still surfaced at odd moments, the reflex to minimize, to shrink, to check that she wasn't taking up too much. She was learning to recognize these as old weather patterns, the habits of a climate she no longer lived in, and to let them pass without being moved by them. It was slow work. She thought it would probably always be slow work. That was all right. She had learned this year that slow work done consistently was how everything worth having got built. In the evenings that autumn, she wrote, not letters, or not only letters. She had started keeping a record in the account book, which had gradually become something more than a record. Notes on the ranch's operation, observations about what had worked and what hadn't in the first growing season, plans for the second, but also other things. She wrote about the morning she had stood at the east window and found the valley beautiful. She wrote about Thomas's version of high praise. She wrote about her father's visit and the wagon going back down the road and the feeling, standing on the porch, of the last weight lifting from her. She wrote about the letters Caleb had written. She wrote about the sparrow. She wrote about the hill in August. She was not sure what she was making. She was not sure it mattered what it was. She had spent her whole life being useful, producing things that had function and purpose, and this was something she was making for no reason except that the act of making it clarified something in her, helped her understand what she was living through well enough to inhabit it more fully. Caleb saw the account book occasionally on the table and did not ask about it. When she told him what she was doing, one evening in November when the fire was good and the first real snow of the season was accumulating outside, he said, "Can I read any of it?" She thought about it. "Someday," she said. "Not yet." "That's fair," he said. "I read 12 years of your private writing," she said. "Seems reasonable you'd have to wait for mine." He looked at her with the expression she had finally and fully named. "I can wait," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's one of the things about you." She looked at the fire. He looked at the fire. The snow came down outside in the particular silence that snow creates, and the house held them, and the sparrow sat on its shelf, and the trellis was in place for the roses she intended to grow, and the root cellar was full, and the ledger on the table showed a ranch in its second year of solid operation with room to expand in the spring. and the account book beside the ledger held the beginning of something she was still writing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" He turned and looked at her directly, and she saw in his face, clear and unguarded, without the careful management she had watched him maintain in the early months, the answer before he said it. "More than I knew how to expect," he said. She nodded slowly. She turned back to the fire. "Me too," she said. It was not a grand statement. She had not made many grand statements in her life, and she was not going to start now for the sake of the occasion. But she meant it with the full weight of everything it had taken to arrive at it. The 23 years in Haller Creek, the wagon ride north in October, the months of waiting for the other shoe that never dropped, the letters and the sparrow and the hill in August, and the roses going into cold ground on the faith that they would come back. She meant it down to the root of it. November brought another letter from Haller Creek. She recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope when Thomas brought it in from town and set it on the table without comment, and she held it for a moment before opening it. She had written him 4 times since June, short and factual letters that said she was well and that the ranch was good and that she hoped the store was managing. He had not replied to any of them. This letter was brief. It said that he had sold the store to the Halverson family, who had wanted a second commercial location in the town for years, and that he intended to move south in the spring to a community near Helena where his sister had settled. He said the sale price had been better than he'd feared. He said, "I expect you are better placed than I am to understand that letting go of a thing is sometimes the only way to find out what you actually wanted." He did not sign it your father. He signed it Harold Whitmore, which was honest in its way, and she folded the letter back into its envelope and set it on the shelf beside the sparrow. She stood there for a moment looking at the two things side by side, the letter and the small pale bird, and she felt nothing that surprised her. Not anger, not grief, not the complicated residue she had expected a letter from her father to produce. Mostly she felt a kind of sober clarity, the feeling of a chapter reaching its actual end rather than just its pause. He was moving south. He was letting go of the store. He had, in his oblique and partial way, told her that letting go sometimes showed you what you wanted. She took that for the acknowledgement it was, neither more nor less, and she was grateful for it without expecting more from it. She wrote back that evening. She wrote that she was glad the sale had gone well and that she hoped the move suited him. She wrote that the ranch was going into its second winter in good shape. She wrote, "I want you to know that I am not angry. I think I was for a long time without knowing it, and I am not anymore. I don't say this to give you something or to ask for anything. I say it because it is true, and because I am trying to be someone who says the true things." She did not sign it with love, which would have been false. She signed it Clara Mercer, her full name, both parts of it, which felt exactly right. The winter of their second year at Blackstone Ridge was harder in some respects and easier in all the ways that mattered. Harder because the cold came earlier and the snow was heavier, and there was a 2-week stretch in January where the temperature dropped to a sustained cruelty that kept them mostly confined and produced in the cattle a collective misery that required daily management. Thomas got through it with characteristic endurance. Caleb worked himself past tired into something that required Clara to occasionally stand in the kitchen doorway and say, "Come inside, the cattle are still there. They'll be there in an hour." And he would come inside and drink the coffee she put in front of him and go back out. And this happened enough times that it became a kind of routine with its own dry familiarity. Easier because she was no longer new to it, because the walls were familiar and the fire's demands were familiar, and the way the wind worked around the north corner of the house was known, and she had learned to read the weather the way Caleb read it, not with his years of experience, but with the beginning of fluency in the language. Because the difficult moments were shared rather than carried alone. Because when the 2-week cold spell finally broke and she came out on the porch into 28-degree air that felt, comparatively, almost warm, and said, "It's over," Caleb came to stand beside her and looked at the sky and said, "For now." And she said, "I know, for now is fine." And that was the whole of it. For now was fine. For now was actually very good. She had been someone who lived for eventually. Eventually things would be different. Eventually she would find a way out. Eventually something would change. She had spent 23 years in eventually. Now she lived in now, which was a smaller and more demanding place to inhabit, but also a more real one, and she found she preferred it. The roses survived the winter. She discovered this in the second week of March, when she went to check the mulch over the roots she had spent the previous autumn protecting, and found the beginning of growth underneath, when, small and stubborn and green, the particular unreasonable insistence of a living thing. She crouched in the cold mud and looked at them for a long time. She went and found Caleb in the barn. "The roses made it," she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "I know," he said. "I checked yesterday. I didn't want to say anything in case I was wrong about what I was seeing." She looked at him. "You were checking my roses." "There are roses," he said. "They're on our house." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the garden. She knelt in the mud and carefully, began to pull away the winter mulch, giving the roots room to breathe, exposing the pale green of new growth to the March light. The ground was cold under her hands, and the sky above was the particular washed-out blue of high country early spring, and she could hear the creek running fast with snowmelt, and from somewhere behind the barn, a cow was making her opinion known about something, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch went on around her. Eventually had become now. Now was this. Mud under her hands and roses making it through a hard winter, and a man who checked on the things she cared about without making a production of it. She was not a burden. She had never been a burden. She was a person who had been handed a story about herself by someone who did not have the authority to write it, and who had spent a long time believing the story because it was the only one she'd been given, and who had come to a valley in northern Montana on a desperate bet and found, against everything she had been taught to expect, that the story was wrong. She understood now something she had not understood at 23, that the people who tell you what you are worth are not telling you about yourself. They are telling you about their own limitations, their fear, their selfishness, their incapacity to value what they cannot use. Harold Whitmore had not reduced her because she was reducible. He had reduced her because reduction was the only tool he had. The people of Haller Creek had dismissed her because dismissal is easier than attention, and most people, given the choice, choose easier. None of it had been evidence. All of it had been noise. The evidence was here, a valley she knew, a garden she had planned and planted and tended, a set of ledger books she could read and correct and improve, a man who had written 12 years of unsent letters and kept a wooden sparrow in his pocket and built a house for an imagined future and had the stubbornness and the faith to make it real. A person who checked on the roses. She had not been unwanted. She had been wanted by the wrong people, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference matters. The first blooms came in June. She saw them on a Tuesday morning, 3 of them, red against the weathered gray of the house wall, small and improbable, and completely serious about being there. She stood in the kitchen garden and looked at them for a long time without moving, the way she had stood in the January cold looking at the frozen waterfall, with the particular stillness of a person receiving something unexpected that they had, against all reason, been hoping for. Thomas came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her standing still. "Roses are up," he said, following her gaze. "Yes," she said. He looked at them for a moment. "Huh," he said, which from Thomas was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Caleb came to find her after the morning cattle check, and she was still in the garden, and he looked at the roses and then at her, and his expression was the one she had named and kept, the hoping, no longer held back from leaning, no longer careful, just openly and quietly there. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. "You built the trellis. You put in the roots," he said. I mulched them. You—" He stopped. He was almost laughing. "Clara." "Caleb," she said, "would you let me give you this one, the roses? Would you let me say you grew roses in Montana in ground that most people would tell you they can't grow in, and they're blooming?" She looked at the 3 red flowers against the gray wall. "All right," she said, "you can have that one." He stood beside her. His hand found hers. The roses moved very slightly in the June morning air, and the valley below them was green with summer, and the creek was bright, and the house with its porch and its trellis and its 60 books stood behind them solid and real and completely, unambiguously theirs. This is what I want you to take from this story. If you take anything at all, the people who tell you that you are too much or not enough, or a burden or a weight, they are not describing you. They are describing their own poverty. The story they are telling is about what they can't hold, not about what you are worth. Some people will carry a wooden sparrow for 15 years. Some people will build a house on the faith of 30 seconds of ordinary decency. Some people will check on your roses without being asked. These are not fairy tales. They're simply what the world looks like when you stop accepting the first story you were given and wait, patiently, stubbornly, through as many hard winters as it takes, for the true one. Clara Whitmore had spent 23 years being told she was unwanted. It had never been true. She stood in a kitchen garden in Montana in June with roses climbing the wall of her house and her husband's hand in hers. And she knew it now with the full and unambiguous certainty of a person who has stopped arguing with the evidence. She was not the woman no one wanted. She was the heart of a house that had been built for her return before she even knew she was gone. The Montana sky was enormous above them, wide and blue and indifferent in the way of all great skies. And underneath it the ranch went on. The cattle and the creek and the garden and the roses and the wooden sparrow on its shelf inside. And Clara Mercer, who had once stood in a doorway in October with a carpet bag and nothing she wanted to keep, stood in June with everything she had chosen and felt, with a fullness she was still learning to trust, that she had finally, truly come home.